My name is James Rohn and welcome to the channel Story for Heart. She had 43 cents in her pocket, a dead mother's handwriting pressed against her chest, and nothing left to lose. What she was about to walk into would either save her, or break the last piece of her that hadn't already been broken. Stay until the end, because this story is about to show you exactly how far one woman will go when she has nothing left but her hands, and her will to survive. Grief has a way of arriving in waves that people think they can prepare for. And Clara Whitmore thought she was prepared, right up until the second wave hit and drowned her completely. Her father went first, and a fever that moved through him so fast the doctor barely had time to shake his head before it was over. 3 days later, the restaurant her parents had spent 20 years building from nothing burned to the ground, as if the universe had decided one tragedy wasn't a clean enough cut. And 6 weeks after that, her mother followed her father into the ground too, not from illness, not really, but from something quieter and crueler. The simple fact that 31 years of loving one man hadn't left her any practice at living without him. Clara was 25 years old, and in the span of 2 months, she had lost her father, her mother, her home, and the only life she had ever known. And that was before Edmund Whitmore showed up. Her uncle had visited exactly 4 times in Clara's entire life, 4 times in 25 years. And yet within a week of her mother's funeral, he was standing in a lawyer's office with papers already drawn up, already knowing exactly where he wanted her signature. He smelled like hair oil and looked at her the way a man looks at an obstacle, rather than a grieving niece. He had money, he had connections, he had a lawyer who understood that a woman with no deed in her name and no male relatives to speak for her had almost no legal ground to stand on in that place. In that year, Clara fought him. She fought him for weeks, through appointments and paperwork, and rooms full of men who spoke about her life, as though she weren't sitting 3 feet away from them. But in the end, fighting wasn't enough. Edmund had every advantage money could buy, and Clara had nothing but the truth. And the truth, it turned out, doesn't carry much weight in a courtroom when you can't afford to be heard. She walked out of that lawyer's office with the clothes on her back, a leather bag, her mother's recipe book clutched against her chest, and 43 cents that Edmund's lawyer seemed to genuinely believe was a generous settlement. She stood on the street outside and gave herself exactly 1 minute to decide something, 1 minute to choose between falling apart and standing up. She chose to stand up, and that decision, made alone on a street corner, with nothing left but a book of her mother's handwriting, is the reason everything that happens next is even possible. 6 months of wandering does something to a person. It wears grooves into you the way water wears grooves into stone, slowly, invisibly, until one day you look down and realize how much of yourself has been carried away. Clara had cooked in boarding houses that shorted her wages and called it a favor. She had worked cattle camp kitchens, where men assumed a woman standing over a stove was an invitation rather than an employee. She had survived 1 week in a place that called itself a hotel and was not, in any honest sense, a hotel at all. Every single time she had packed her bag, tucked her mother's recipe book against her ribs, and walked toward the next rumor of work, because stopping felt more dangerous than moving. Then came Marston, and a boarding house owner who paid her half of what he'd promised, and justified it to her face without so much as blinking. And then came May Douglas, sharp-eyed, blunt, 60 years old, and the first person in 6 months, who spoke to Clara like she deserved a straight answer instead of a performance. May told her about the Callahan Ranch 40 miles east, the biggest cattle operation in 3 counties, a cook of 12 years who had vanished one morning without a word, leaving Ethan Callahan, a man May described as hard, exacting, and utterly unwilling to forgive a mistake, with 32 hungry men, and no one to feed them. It should have sounded like a warning. Instead, it sounded like the only door still open to her. Clara walked 40 miles in 3 days. No wagon, no money for one, just boots with a hole worn clean through the left sole and a recipe book she refused to let out of her hands. When she finally stood at the gate of the Callahan Ranch, dust-covered and running on almost nothing, the guard took one look at her and clearly expected to turn her away, until she said May Douglas's name, and something in his face shifted. She was given 8 minutes of waiting, and then a door opening, and then Ethan Callahan himself, studying her the way a man studies land he's deciding whether to buy. One dinner, 32 men, whatever was left in the kitchen stores, succeed and there was a place for her, fail, and she'd be sent right back down that same 40 miles of road she'd just walked. She had nothing left to lose, and everything left to prove, and 4 hours to do it in. There's a particular kind of understanding that passes between two people who have both learned to survive by shutting certain doors inside themselves. And it happened in Ethan Callahan's office in less than a sentence. "The men here work hard," he told her, before she'd even seen the kitchen. "They're tired by evening. They need food that means something, not just food that fills a plate." He said it like an instruction, like a rule of the house. But Clara heard something else underneath it. The voice of a man who had built something enormous out of sheer will, who fed 32 hands 3 times a day and somehow understood, without ever having been taught, that a meal could be more than fuel, that it could be the one moment in a brutal, backbreaking day when a man felt like somebody had thought about him, specifically, on purpose. It was the exact same lesson Clara's mother had spent a lifetime teaching her, standing over a stove in a New Orleans kitchen that no longer existed. "A good meal doesn't just feed the body," her mother used to say. "It reminds a person they matter to somebody." Clara stood alone in the ranch's enormous, half-organized kitchen, good cast iron, a stove worth being proud of, better beef than she'd seen in months, courtesy of a man who owned more cattle than he probably could count. And she heard her mother's voice as clearly as if the woman were standing beside her. "You can make a meal from almost anything, if you understand what the person eating it actually needs." So she asked herself the question her mother had taught her to always ask first, before flour, before fire, before anything else. What did these men actually need? Not just calories, not just a full plate at the end of an 18-hour day. They needed to feel, for 20 minutes at the supper table, like the person who cooked for them had cared enough to get it right. She started the bread first because bread needs time, and because she knew, the way she knew her own name, that the smell of real bread rising could change the entire mood of a room before a single other dish ever reached the table. Then the beef, braised slow with onions and dried herbs she found hanging above the stove. The same technique. Her mother had used to turn tough cuts tender and tender cuts unforgettable. 4 hours, 4 dishes, 1 chance. And somewhere underneath all of it, without either of them saying so out loud, Clara Whitmore and Ethan Callahan had just discovered they believed the exact same thing about what it means to feed another human being. And neither of them had any idea, yet how much that single shared belief was about to change both of their lives.